The oldest temple on Earth was built by people who had never planted a single seed. Let that land for a moment. Think about everything you were ever taught about how civilization begins. First, humans learned to farm. Then they built permanent settlements. Then, over generations, those settlements grew into towns, and those towns developed religion, and that religion eventually inspired monuments. That is the sequence. That is the ladder. That is the story every textbook, every museum, every history class has handed us since we were children. And then, in the dry hills of southeastern Turkey, someone put a shovel in the ground, and the ladder shattered. What they found was not supposed to exist. Not there. Not then. Not built by the kind of people history said were living at that time. And yet there it was, 12,000 years old, deliberately carved, impossibly organized. And it did not just challenge one assumption about the ancient world. It challenged all of them at once. This is the story of that place. And it is also the story of 5 others just like it. Civilizations that built, calculated, engineered, and imagined in ways that the modern world is only now beginning to fully appreciate. Not myths, not legends. Civilizations backed by stone and bone and bronze and data that you can hold in your hand and examine under a microscope. By the end of this documentary, one thing will be undeniable. We have been dramatically underestimating the people who came before us. And the implications of that underestimation reach all the way to today. There's a version of human history that feels deeply satisfying. It goes something like this. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans wandered. They hunted animals. They gathered plants. They painted on cave walls and huddled around fires and lived short, brutal lives in small, disconnected bands. They were, for all practical purposes, surviving, not thriving, not building, not thinking in the organized, ambitious way that we associate with civilization, just surviving. Then, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. Humans in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East began to domesticate crops. They learned to plant wheat and barley. They tamed goats and cattle. And because farming meant staying in one place, settlements appeared. And because settlements meant more people in closer proximity, social structures emerged. Leadership, religion, specialization of labor, trade. And from those foundations, the great civilizations of the ancient world gradually rose. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Greece, Rome. It is a clean story. It is a logical story. It has a satisfying internal architecture where each development depends on the one before it, like a row of dominoes falling in exactly the right order. And for most of the 20th century, it was the story that archaeology largely supported. The problem is that it is not the whole truth, because the neat sequence, farming first, then settlement, then religion, then monuments, that sequence assumes something that we never actually proved. It assumes that complex, organized behavior, the kind of behavior required to plan, fund, and execute a large construction project over multiple generations, that this kind of behavior could only emerge after humans had first secured a reliable food supply. It assumes that ambition followed agriculture. And a man named Klaus Schmidt spent the last 2 decades of his life proving that assumption wrong. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt was a German archaeologist working in the region of Anatolia in what is now southeastern Turkey. He had been directed to a site that a previous survey in the 1960s had noted almost in passing. The surveyors at the time had looked at the limestone slabs protruding from the top of a ridge called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly to Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and concluded they were probably just medieval gravestones. Not worth a serious dig. Schmidt looked at the same slabs and saw something different. He began excavating, and what emerged from beneath the hillside did not fit inside any existing framework for understanding prehistoric humanity. What Schmidt and his team uncovered slowly and painstakingly over the years that followed were circles. Massive, deliberate circles of T-shaped limestone pillars, arranged with clear intentionality, carved with extraordinary skill and oriented in ways that suggest careful astronomical and symbolic thinking. The largest pillars stood over 18 feet tall and weighed up to 16 tons. They had been quarried from bedrock located up to a quarter-mile away, shaped with flint tools, and set upright in stone sockets cut specifically to receive them. This was not random. This was not accidental. This required planning, engineering, coordination, and a workforce organized around a shared purpose. And when Schmidt's team sent samples for radiocarbon dating, the results came back and sat on the table like a bomb. The site dated to approximately 9,600 BCE. Let that number breathe. 9,600 years before the Common Era. That is approximately 11,600 years ago from today. To put that in perspective, Stonehenge was built around 3000 BCE. That makes Göbekli Tepe older than Stonehenge by 6,600 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates it by more than 7,000 years. The oldest currently known written record for Mesopotamia date to around 3,400 BCE. Göbekli Tepe was already ancient history by then. Schmidt would later describe the moment of understanding what he had found as one of the most disorienting experiences of his professional life. He said, and this is close to a direct rendering of his sentiment, that archaeologists had been looking at the origins of civilization from entirely the wrong end. He was right. Here is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. The archaeological evidence around the site is consistent and clear on this point. There is no evidence of cultivated crops in the earliest layers. No evidence of domesticated animals in the site's founding period. No permanent residential structures. The people who organized the labor, who designed the pillars, who selected the images to be carved into the stone, and who supervised the transport or erection of 16-ton limestone blocks across a hilly landscape. These people were hunter-gatherers. They were, by the definition we had been using, prehistoric in the truest sense of the word. They lived before writing, before agriculture, before what we had always assumed were the prerequisites for any kind of organized, ambitious, large-scale human endeavor. And yet, here is what the site tells us they were capable of. They could sustain a workforce large enough to quarry, transport, and erect massive stone pillars over an extended period of time. Estimates vary, but some researchers suggest that completing even a single enclosure at Göbekli Tepe would have required somewhere between 500 and 1,000 workers laboring over years. That workforce had to be fed. That workforce had to be organized. Someone had to lead. Someone had to plan. Someone had to maintain the shared agreement across years and possibly generations that this project was worth continuing. That is not primitive behavior. That is institutional behavior. That is the behavior of a society with hierarchy, with long-term planning, with the ability to mobilize collective effort toward a goal that offered no immediate survival benefit. And the carvings themselves, that is another story entirely. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not blank monuments. They are covered in bas-relief sculptures of animals, many of which appear to have been selected deliberately and with symbolic intent. Foxes appear frequently. So do boars, cranes, ducks, snakes, and scorpions. Some of the central pillars in each enclosure appear to have humanoid features, with carved arms and hands, suggesting they may represent anthropomorphic figures, perhaps deities, perhaps ancestors, perhaps both. This is symbolic and religious art executed at a monumental scale by people who, according to our previous understanding of history, should not have had either the leisure, the organizational capacity, or the conceptual framework to produce it. Schmidt himself believed, based on years of careful study, that Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. It was a sanctuary, a place that people traveled to, possibly from considerable distances, for purposes that were spiritual or ceremonial in nature. It was, in his interpretation, the world's first temple, built not because people had extra time and resources left over after securing their survival. Built because they believed they had to build it. And that distinction, that the monument preceded the agriculture rather than following it. That is the detail that rearranges everything. In 2001, Klaus Schmidt proposed something that many of his colleagues initially found difficult to accept. What if the construction of Göbekli Tepe was not made possible by the agricultural revolution? What if it caused it? Here is the logic, and it is worth following carefully because it fundamentally reframes not just the story of this site, but the story of human civilization as a whole. Building and maintaining Göbekli Tepe over the centuries during which it was active required feeding a large, concentrated workforce on a sustained basis. Wild game and forage plants, the resources available to typical hunter-gatherers of the period, would not have been sufficient to feed hundreds of people laboring at a fixed location over extended periods. That logistical problem created a pressure, a need, a demand for a more reliable, more controllable, more scalable food source. And Göbekli Tepe sits at the heart of the Fertile Crescent, the very region where the world's first domesticated wheat, called einkorn, is believed to have originated. Genetic studies of modern einkorn wheat have traced its wild ancestor to a population growing on the slopes of a mountain called Karcha Dag, which sits approximately 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe. This proximity is not, in the view of many researchers, a coincidence. The working hypothesis that has gained serious traction in the archaeological community is this. The religious and ceremonial imperative that drove the construction of Göbekli Tepe created the need for a stable food supply, which created the pressure that led to the domestication of wild grain, which created agriculture, which eventually created everything else. In other words, it was not abundance that built the temple. It was the temple that built abundance. It was not civilization that created religion. It was the impulse towards something larger than individual survival, the impulse we might call spiritual, that created civilization. That is a reversal so complete that it does not just challenge one assumption in our history books. It challenges the foundational premise of how we have explained the human story for the past 100 years. There is one more detail about Göbekli Tepe that demands attention. One more layer of the mystery that archaeologists are still working to understand. Around 8000 BCE, after centuries of use and construction, the site was deliberately buried. Not destroyed, not abandoned in haste, not covered by the gradual accumulation of sand and debris over millennia. Buried, intentionally. The excavation evidence shows that the enclosures were systematically filled in with a mixture of flint tools, animal bones, and stone debris, as if the entire site was being deliberately put to rest. Sealed, preserved. Why would a society that had invested what must have been an almost incomprehensible amount of collective human effort in building this place choose to fill it in and walk away? That question does not have an answer yet. There are theories. Perhaps the burial was a ritual act of closure, a way of honoring the end of a particular religious or ceremonial era. Perhaps the filling was protective, an attempt to preserve what had been built against some anticipated threat. Perhaps the act of burial was itself a kind of offering. What we do know is that whoever made the decision understood what they were doing. They were not covering up a failure. They were completing something. The deliberate, careful nature of the fill, the mix of objects deposited within it, suggests a society that placed enormous significance on this act of ending as much as on the act of building. And in a strange, unintended consequence, their decision to bury the site is precisely why it survived. The deliberate fill protected the pillars and carvings from erosion and looting for 11,600 years, preserving them in extraordinary condition until a German archaeologist arrived with a shovel and changed our understanding of human history. Some gifts take a long time to arrive. So what do we do with Göbekli Tepe? We cannot explain it away. It has been dated. It has been excavated. It has been analyzed by geologists, archaeologists, architectural historians, and geneticists. It is not a myth or a legend or a fringe theory published in a sensationalist book. It is a peer-reviewed, internationally studied UNESCO World Heritage Site sitting in the hills of Turkey, and it is telling us something that we have not yet fully absorbed. It is telling us that the human story is older, deeper, and more complex than we thought. That the capacity for organized ambition, for symbolic thinking, for collective construction, for the impulse to reach towards something beyond immediate survival, that these capacities were not gifts that agriculture gave us. They were qualities we already possessed, qualities that may, in the end, be inseparable from what it means to be human at all. 12,000 years ago, a group of people who had never planted a crop and never lived in a permanent city looked at a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey and saw something in it. Something worth building. Something worth feeding hundreds of people to construct. Something worth generations of shared effort and belief. And when they were done, they buried it carefully, as if they knew that someday someone would need to find it. We needed to find it, because Göbekli Tepe is not just a site. It is a mirror, and what it reflects back at us is the uncomfortable, electrifying truth that the line between primitive and advanced, between ancient and modern, between them and us, has always been far thinner than we were willing to admit. Göbekli Tepe was not an accident. It was not a fluke. It was a statement, a declaration, written in 16-ton limestone, that human beings have always been capable of more than survival. And if one society made that statement 12,000 years ago, the real question is not how many others did the same across the ancient world. The real question is, how many of them have we not found yet? Göbekli Tepe showed us what humans could imagine before they had any of the tools we assume imagination requires. But imagination alone does not build a city. It does not lay a sewer pipe. It does not calculate the precise gradient needed to move water across 40 miles of open countryside without a pump. It does not standardize a unit of weight so reliably that merchants 500 miles apart are using the same measurement system without ever having met. Those things require something beyond inspiration. They require sustained, organized, multi-generational intelligence applied to the practical problems of human life. They require a society that has decided, collectively, that the quality of daily existence for ordinary people is worth the engineering effort. They require, in other words, civilization in its fullest sense. The next two societies we are about to meet understood that at a level that, when you examine the evidence carefully, is difficult to fully process. Because both of them solve problems that the modern world is still struggling with. Both of them built cities that function better, in certain measurable ways, than cities being built thousands of years after them. And both of them were forgotten so completely that for most of recorded history, no one even knew they had existed. The first stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The second gave Europe its very first civilization, 1,500 years before Greece. And neither of them gets nearly the attention they deserve. That ends now. In the early 20th century, when European archaeologists were racing to uncover the ancient world, there were two names that dominated the conversation. Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates. These were the twin cradles of civilization, the places where writing and law and organized religion and monumental architecture first took shape. That was the consensus. That was the map. And then, in the 1920s, excavations at two sites in what is now Pakistan began to quietly dismantle that consensus. The sites were called Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. They had been sitting in the ground, almost completely unknown, while scholars celebrated the pyramids and the ziggurats and the walls of Babylon. And what emerged from those excavations was so unexpected, so fully formed, so unlike anything the archaeological community had been prepared to find in that region and at that depth and time, that some of the initial reports were met with outright skepticism. The skeptics were wrong. What archaeologists had stumbled into was not a minor regional culture. It was one of the largest, most sophisticated, and most internally consistent civilizations the ancient world ever produced. A civilization that, at its height between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE, extended across roughly 1.5 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that is larger than the entire landmass of Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It stretched from what is now northeastern Afghanistan in the north to the coast of the Arabian Sea in the south, and from the foothills of the Himalayas in the east to the deserts of Balochistan in the west. At its peak, the Indus Valley civilization may have supported a population of somewhere between 1 and 5 million people, spread across more than 1,000 known settlement sites, including at least 5 cities that qualify as large urban centers by any reasonable definition. This was not a collection of villages. This was a world. And it was a world that had figured out things that the rest of the ancient world would take centuries longer to understand. Let's start with the cities, because the cities are where the evidence becomes genuinely startling. Mohenjo-daro, at its height around 2500 BCE, was home to an estimated 40,000 people. That makes it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. But the size is not the impressive part. What is impressive is the design. The streets of Mohenjo-daro were laid out on a grid. A true, deliberate, engineered grid with major boulevards running roughly north to south and intersecting streets crossing them at right angles. The streets were wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other. The widest were approximately 30 feet across. This is not organic urban growth, the kind of sprawl that emerges naturally when people build wherever there is space. This is planned urban design. Someone drew this city before it was built, and the same grid system appears at Harappa, hundreds of miles to the northeast, and at Dhalavura, a site in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat, and at Rakhigarhi, and at Lothal, and at dozens of other Indus Valley settlements scattered across the subcontinent. The same proportions, the same logic, the same approach to organizing urban space. Across an area larger than Western Europe, a consistent urban planning philosophy was being applied with remarkable uniformity. The bricks tell the same story. Archaeologists have measured the fired clay bricks used in Indus Valley construction across sites spanning hundreds of miles, and found that the ratio of width to height to length is almost universally consistent. The standard brick proportion appears to be roughly 1 to 2 to 4. At every site, every time. This is not coincidence. This is standardization. This implies either a central authority enforcing uniform building codes or a deeply ingrained cultural consensus about the correct way to build, shared across an enormous geographic area. What that tells us about the organizational capacity of this civilization is significant. You do not achieve that kind of uniformity by accident. You achieve it through governance or through tradition so strong it functions like governance. But here is the detail that should stop every person who has ever complained about infrastructure in a modern city. The Indus Valley civilization built the world's first known urban sanitation system, and it was not rudimentary. It was not a handful of open trenches. It was a comprehensive, citywide, engineered network of covered drainage that connected private homes to public sewers, and those sewers to outlets designed to carry waste well clear of the residential areas. Almost every house excavated at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had its own bathing area and latrine. The latrines drained through clay pipes set into the walls, which connected to covered brick channels running beneath the streets. Those channels were large enough for a person to walk through for maintenance. They included inspection ports at regular intervals. They were built with a deliberate gradient so that gravity moved the waste through the system without pumping. This is applied civil engineering. This is infrastructure planning. And it was operating in the Indus Valley around 2500 BCE. London, one of the most sophisticated cities in the modern world, did not have a comprehensive underground sewer system until the 1860s CE. That is a gap of approximately 4,300 years. For the majority of recorded Western history, cities that considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization were managing human waste in ways that would have been considered inadequate by the standards of Mohenjo-daro. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro deserves its own mention. It is a large, watertight public pool, approximately 40 feet long, 23 feet wide, and 8 feet deep, constructed with carefully fitted bricks sealed with bitumen to prevent leaking. It had steps leading down into the water changing rooms along its edges, and a sophisticated drainage system for emptying and refilling it. Scholars believe it served a ritual bathing function, possibly connected to purification ceremonies. Whatever its specific purpose, it represents a level of hydraulic engineering and civic investment in shared public infrastructure that most ancient societies never approached. The Indus people understood something that took the rest of the world a very long time to relearn: that the health of a city depends on the quality of its water management. That public sanitation is not a luxury. It is the foundation on which everything else rests. One of the most quietly astonishing things about the Indus Valley civilization is found not in its architecture, but in a collection of small, carefully crafted stone cubes. Archaeologists have recovered standardized weights from Indus Valley sites across the full geographic extent of the civilization. These weights come in a consistent series of ratios based on a binary and decimal system. And when the weights found at Mohenjo-daro in modern Pakistan are compared to weights found at Lathal in modern India, separated by over 400 miles, they match. Not approximately. They match within a margin of error so small, it implies a shared standard of measurement enforced, or at least deeply respected, across the entire civilization. This means trade. Regulated, standardized trade across an enormous area, with a shared metrological system that allowed merchants in distant cities to trust each other's measurements without needing to personally verify them. That is a sophisticated commercial and legal framework. It implies contracts. It implies accountability. It implies a society where commerce operated according to agreed-upon rules. And yet, here is one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. In all the excavations conducted across the Indus Valley, archaeologists have found no palaces, no temples that clearly dominate the landscape in the way that religious architecture dominates Mesopotamian or Egyptian cities. No royal tombs filled with gold and the bodies of sacrificed servants. No mass graves. No extensive weapons caches. No images of kings standing triumphant over defeated enemies, which is the kind of monumental propaganda that virtually every other major ancient civilization produced in abundance. The Indus Valley civilization, at its height, one of the largest and most sophisticated urban cultures in the world, has left almost no trace of the kind of centralized, militaristic, hierarchical power structure that we typically associate with ancient states of comparable scale. What does that mean? It could mean the evidence has not yet been found. It could mean governance was decentralized in ways we do not yet understand. It could mean that the Indus Valley came closer than almost any other ancient civilization to something that political philosophers still debate as a theoretical ideal: a large, complex, functionally egalitarian society without a visible ruling class. We do not know. Because of their script, the Indus Valley had a writing system. Thousands of small seals have been recovered, each inscribed with a sequence of symbols, accompanied often by an animal figure. The symbols are consistent and clearly meaningful. They repeat in recognizable patterns. They appear on seals, pottery, and tablets across the full extent of the civilization, and they have never been deciphered. Indus script remains one of the great unresolved puzzles of linguistics and archaeology. Without a bilingual text, without an equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, the precise meaning of those symbols has so far resisted every serious attempt at translation. We cannot read what these people wrote. We cannot hear what they said about themselves. We can only look at what they built and try to understand them through the evidence of their choices. What we know is that around 1900 BCE, the great Indus cities began to empty. Not suddenly, not through conquest, gradually. The evidence points to a combination of climate change, prolonged drought, and the shifting of major rivers, particularly the Gagar-Hakra, which may have been the great river the ancient texts called the Sarasvati. As water became less reliable, the agricultural systems that fed the cities became less productive. People moved. The cities shrank. The urban networks dissolved. There was no final battle, no catastrophic burning. The Indus Valley civilization did not end with a bang. It ended with a slow, quiet unraveling, as the environment that had sustained it for centuries withdrew its cooperation, and the world moved on, and forgot For 3,700 years, the cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa sat beneath the ground, unknown to the civilizations that rose and fell above them. Their drains still ran beneath the earth. Their standardized bricks were still stacked in their walls. Their unread seals were still pressed into the clay. They were waiting. The way things that deserve to be remembered always wait. When we talk about the origins of Western civilization, we almost always begin in the same place. Ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, of philosophy, of theater, of the foundational intellectual and artistic traditions that eventually fed the Roman Empire, and then, through Rome, the entire arc of European and Western history that follows. Greece is where the West begins. That is the story. That is the consensus. And it is not exactly wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. Because when classical Greek civilization was hitting its stride in the 5th century BCE, building the Parthenon and hosting the first Olympic Games and writing the plays of Sophocles, there was already a civilization more than 1,000 years in its past that had been doing extraordinary things on an island 60 miles off the Greek coast. That civilization had running water delivered through pressurized clay pipes to upper floors of buildings. It had multi-story palaces engineered with earthquake resistance built into the wall structure. It had a maritime trade network that reached from Egypt to the British Isles. It had an administrative bureaucracy, an artistic tradition of extraordinary sophistication, and a standard of daily comfort that most of the ancient Mediterranean world would not approach for centuries. And it had all of this before the Greeks, before the Romans, before any of the civilizations that the Western world typically credits with laying its foundations. The civilization was the Minoan culture of Crete, and its story is one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated chapters in the entire history of human achievement. The center of Minoan civilization was the Palace of Knossos, located near the northern coast of Crete, and first seriously excavated by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans beginning in 1900 CE. What Evans uncovered over the years that followed was so complex, so layered, and so unexpected that he initially struggled to find adequate language to describe it. The palace was enormous. At its height, around 1700 to 1450 BCE, it covered approximately 150,000 square feet across multiple stories. It contained over 1,000 rooms, including storerooms, workshops, residential quarters, ceremonial spaces, and administrative offices. It had internal light wells, open shafts built into the structure specifically to channel daylight and fresh air into interior rooms, a solution to the problem of illuminating and ventilating a large building that is both elegant and architecturally sophisticated. The storerooms at Knossos held enormous storage vessels called pithoi, some of them taller than a full-grown adult, used to store olive oil, wine, grain, and other goods. The scale of the storage infrastructure suggests the palace functioned not just as a royal residence, but as an economic hub, receiving, processing, and redistributing agricultural produce from across the island and beyond. This is a redistributive economy in action, managed through a centralized administrative system with records kept in the Minoan writing system called Linear A. And the construction itself. Evans noticed, and later structural analyses confirmed, that the walls of the Palace of Knossos incorporated horizontal timber beams set into the masonry at regular intervals. For a long time, this was interpreted simply as a building technique. But modern structural engineers who have studied the palace have offered a different interpretation. Crete sits on one of the most seismically active fault systems in Europe. Earthquakes are not an occasional risk in this region. They are a regular feature of the landscape, and the technique of lacing timber into masonry walls creates a structure with dramatically improved flexibility, one that absorbs and distributes the energy of seismic movement rather than fracturing under it. The Minoans, in other words, may have been practicing earthquake engineering 3,500 years before the discipline formally existed. Not because they understood seismology in any modern sense, but because they had built on Crete long enough to learn, through repeated, painful experience, what kind of construction survived and what kind did not. Experience is the oldest teacher. and the Minoans were excellent students. Now, let us talk about water, because this is where the Minoan achievement becomes almost difficult to believe without the physical evidence in front of you. The Palace of Knossos had running water, not simply a well or a cistern with buckets. Running water, a clay pipe system that carried fresh water under pressure from a source outside the palace through a network of pipes that terminated at fountains, basins, and bathing facilities within the building. Some sections of the pipe system were designed with tapered interiors, narrowing toward the outlet end, which increases the velocity of the water flow and reduces sediment buildup. That is applied hydraulic engineering. That is the same principle that modern plumbers use. The drainage system was equally sophisticated. Wastewater from bathing areas drained through clay pipes that archaeologists have traced running through the walls and beneath the floors of the palace. At certain points, the drainage channels are designed with parabolic cross-sections, a curved interior shape that promotes faster, cleaner flow and resists clogging. This is not guesswork or accident. This is deliberate engineering based on empirical observation of how fluids behave. The palace also had what Evans interpreted as flush-style latrines, with drainage channels running beneath them connecting to the broader sewer system. Arthur Evans, when he described what he found, noted that the Minoan drainage and water supply system appeared to be not merely functional, but carefully considered, as if the engineers who designed it had thought through edge cases and failure modes. The parabolic drains, the tapered pipes, the overflow channels. These are the features of a system designed by people who had built water infrastructure before, who had watched earlier systems fail, and who had incorporated those lessons into the next iteration. This is how engineering advances. This is how knowledge accumulates. And it was accumulating in a Bronze Age palace on a Mediterranean island around 2000 BCE. The Minoans were not an isolated island culture quietly developing their plumbing in obscurity. They were one of the dominant maritime and commercial powers of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. At their peak, their trading network was one of the most extensive the ancient world had yet produced. Minoan artifacts, pottery, art, and trade goods have been recovered from archaeological sites in Egypt, Cyprus, Syria, the Levantine coast, mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, and as far as the British Isles, where Minoan-influenced goods appear to have arrived through multi-stage trade chains. Minoan influence on Egyptian art is documented. Minoan merchants and diplomats appear in Egyptian tomb paintings. The palace at Knossos received goods from across the known world and sent out olive oil, wine, textiles, and bronze in return. This was a civilization that understood the sea not as a barrier, but as a highway. And they used that highway with a confidence and regularity that placed them at the economic and cultural center of an entire region. And then there's the art. The frescoes of Minoan Crete are among the most vivid and alive images to survive from the entire ancient world. They show natural landscapes, flowing rivers, birds in flight, and flowers rendered with a joy and an accuracy that feels almost modern in its sensibility. They show athletes, famous images of young men and women grasping the horns of charging bulls and vaulting over their backs, a ritual or sport or ceremony that speaks to a culture with a deeply physical, kinetic relationship to its world. And they show women in elaborate, stylized dress, women in positions of apparent ceremonial authority, women presiding over religious scenes. The frescoes of Knossos suggest, without conclusively proving, a society in which women held significant public and religious roles. That is a social arrangement that many civilizations claiming to be far more advanced would not reach for another 3,000 years. Around 1450 BCE, Minoan civilization collapsed. The mechanism is still debated. The eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, approximately 70 miles north of Crete, generated tsunamis and an ash fall of enormous scale sometime between 1650 and 1500 BCE. The precise timing and the extent of its direct damage to Minoan civilization remains a topic of active research, but it is considered a significant contributing factor. What the evidence clearly shows is that in the decades and centuries around 1450 BCE, the great palaces of Crete were destroyed, most of them by fire, and the Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland moved in to fill the power vacuum. The deep knowledge of hydraulic engineering, the artistic traditions, the administrative systems, the seafaring networks, much of it fragmented, diluted, or simply ceased to be practiced as the people who carried the knowledge scattered or died. What the Minoans left behind was something more diffuse, but arguably more enduring. Their writing system, Linear A, gave rise to Linear B, the writing system that the Mycenaeans adapted to write the earliest known form of the Greek language. Linear B is the ancestor of the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet is the ancestor of the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet is the ancestor of the letters you are reading right now. There is an unbroken thread of transmission that runs from a Minoan scribe pressing symbols into clay on Crete around 1800 BCE to every piece of written communication in the Western world today. We do not know what those original symbols meant. We cannot read what the Minoans wrote in their own language, but they wrote it in a form that survived, and the form traveled forward and became, in ways no one at Knossos could have imagined, the foundation of everything written that came after. Some inheritances are invisible until you know where to look. Two civilizations, one stretching across the Indian subcontinent at a scale that dwarfed every other Bronze Age power. One perched on a Mediterranean island at the geographic crossroads of three continents. Neither of them related to each other. Neither of them in contact as far as we know. And yet, both of them arriving, through their own independent paths of development, at strikingly similar conclusions about what a city should provide its people. Clean water, managed waste, organized streets, standardized commerce, public spaces that dignified ordinary human life rather than merely serving the ambitions of kings. They were not primitive. They were not accidentally advanced. They were civilizations that had thought carefully and at length about the problem of how to organize human existence at scale. And in certain measurable, concrete, archaeological ways, they solved that problem more elegantly than societies that came thousands of years after them. They disappeared. The Indus Valley dissolved into the dust as the rivers moved. Minoan Crete burned, and what rose from the ashes borrowed the Minoan alphabet, but could not recover the Minoan pipes. But they had already done something that cannot be undone. They had proven, in brick and clay and fired pottery and stone-cut drains, that the ambition to build a good city for ordinary people was not a modern idea. It was apparently one of the oldest ideas we have. There's a particular kind of arrogance that runs quietly beneath the surface of how Western civilization has told the story of science. It goes something like this. Rational inquiry began in ancient Greece. It was refined slowly through the Roman period. It then largely went dormant during the medieval centuries, before being recovered and accelerated during the European Renaissance. From there, it built toward the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and then onward to the technological world we inhabit today. Science, in this telling, has a clear address, a clear ancestry, a specific cultural lineage rooted in one corner of one continent. That story is not entirely false, but it is so incomplete that in certain critical ways, it functions as a distortion. Because while Europe was still centuries away from the intellectual frameworks we associate with scientific thinking, a civilization in the rainforests of Mesoamerica had independently developed the concept of zero, built a calendar more precise than the one medieval Europe was using, and mapped the movements of the planet Venus to an accuracy that modern astronomers find genuinely remarkable. And in a workshop somewhere in the Hellenistic Greek world, engineers and mathematicians were building a bronze device of such mechanical sophistication that it would sit alone and unmatched for 1,400 years after the civilization that created it was gone. Two civilizations. Two independent acts of scientific and intellectual ambition that the world was not supposed to be capable of at the times they occurred. Both forgotten. Both recovered only because a handful of determined scholars refused to accept that ancient people were incapable of brilliance. What they recovered should permanently retire the word primitive from every serious conversation about the ancient world. To understand the Maya, you have to first let go of the idea that they represent a single moment in time. The Maya civilization is not a brief episode. It is not a single dynasty, a single city, or a single cultural flowering that lasted a few centuries before collapsing. The Maya represent one of the longest continuous traditions of intellectual and cultural development in human history. A tradition that stretches from approximately 2000 BCE, when the earliest Maya settlements appear in the archaeological record, to the Spanish conquest of the 16th century CE, and in many meaningful ways, straight through to today. The Maya world at its height, during what archaeologists call the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, was spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. It was not a single unified empire in the way Rome was. It was a constellation of city-states, each with its own ruler, its own patron deities, its own artistic style, and its own political ambitions. These city-states traded with each other, fought each other, formed alliances, absorbed each other, and competed for prestige in ways that bear a striking resemblance to the Greek city-states of the classical Mediterranean. A parallel that is more than superficial. Cities like Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, and Calakmul were not modest settlements. At its height, Tikal in what is now northern Guatemala was home to somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 people, supported by an agricultural system that had transformed the surrounding rainforest into one of the most productive food-producing landscapes in the ancient Americas. The city's central core contained temples rising over 200 feet above the jungle floor, palaces, administrative buildings, ball courts, and a network of causeways connecting the ceremonial center to the residential districts that sprawled for miles in every direction. And at the intellectual center of all of it, running through every aspect of Maya life from agriculture to religion to politics to architecture, was a relationship with time and the sky that had no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. Let's be precise about what zero is and why it matters. Zero is not simply the absence of something. Zero is a number, a placeholder, a concept that allows a positional number system to function, meaning a system where the value of a digit depends on its position relative to other digits. Without zero as a genuine numerical concept, advanced mathematics becomes extraordinarily cumbersome. Algebra, as we know, is essentially impossible. Calculus cannot exist. The entire mathematical architecture of modern science and engineering depends, at its foundation, on the concept of zero as a number in its own right. The Maya independently invented this concept. Their number system was vigesimal, meaning it was based on units of 20 rather than the units of 10 that the decimal system uses. It was positional, meaning the value of a number depended on where it sat in the sequence. And to make that positional system work, the Maya developed a glyph representing zero, a concept they appear to have been using as early as the 4th century BCE, though some evidence suggests the concept was operational in Maya mathematics even earlier. The independently developed zero appeared in India around the 5th century CE. It reached the Arab mathematical tradition in the 8th century CE, and through Arab scholarship, it finally arrived in Europe in the 12th century CE. The Maya were using zero in sophisticated mathematical calculations nearly 1,000 years before European mathematicians had access to the concept. And they were not using it abstractly, purely as a theoretical exercise. They were using it to solve a practical problem of staggering ambition. They were using it to measure time across thousands of years with precision. The Maya did not have one calendar. They had 3 interlocking calendar systems, each serving a different purpose, and the interaction between them produced a temporal framework of extraordinary sophistication. The first was the Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar used primarily for religious and ceremonial purposes. Each day had a name and a number, and the 260-day cycle was used to determine auspicious and inauspicious dates for everything from planting crops to naming children to launching military campaigns. Scholars are still debating exactly why 260 days was chosen, but several compelling theories connect it to the human gestation period, to agricultural cycles in the Maya lowlands, and to astronomical phenomena, including the synodic period of certain planets. The second was the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short 5-day period at the end of the year considered particularly dangerous and ill-omened. This calendar tracked the solar year for agricultural planning and civic administration. When the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Hab were combined, they created a larger cycle called the calendar round, which lasted approximately 52 years before the two calendars aligned again at the same starting point. This 52-year cycle was a fundamental unit of Maya historical and ceremonial time. But the Maya went further still. For tracking longer historical spans, they developed what is called the long count calendar, a linear count of days from a fixed starting point in the distant past, a date that most scholars correlate to approximately 3114 BCE in our calendar. The long count allowed Maya scribes and astronomers to record dates across a span of thousands of years with complete precision, placing historical events, astronomical observations, and ceremonial records in an unambiguous temporal framework. The long count is the calendar that generated enormous international interest in 2012, when its first major cycle of approximately 5,125 years came to completion. The ending of that cycle was misrepresented in popular culture as a Maya prophecy of apocalypse. It was not. For the Maya, it was simply the end of a large cycle and the beginning of the next one, the equivalent of an odometer rolling over from 99,999 to zero. The Panic of 2012 was a modern invention. The calendar itself was a monument to ancient mathematical precision. The calendars did not exist in isolation. They were the product of a systematic, sustained, and extraordinarily precise program of astronomical observation that the Maya pursued across centuries, recording what they saw and refining their models across generations in a way that constitutes, by any reasonable definition, a scientific tradition. The Maya tracked the sun. They tracked the moon, developing eclipse prediction tables that accounted for the complex relationship between lunar and solar cycles. They tracked Mars, and they tracked Venus with a dedication and an accuracy that remains one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of pre-telescopic astronomy anywhere in the world. Venus holds a special significance in Maya cosmology. It was associated with the feathered serpent deity known as Kukulkan, and its appearances as the morning star and evening star were considered omens of great power, tied to cycles of war, sacrifice, and renewal. Understanding the Venus cycle was not merely a scientific project for the Maya. It was a religious and political imperative. The Venus tables preserved in the Dresden Codex, one of only 4 Maya books to survive the Spanish conquest, record the synodic cycle of Venus with a documented accuracy that is difficult to overstate. The Maya calculated the average Venus year at 583.92 days. Modern measurements place it at 583.92 days. That is not an approximation. That is a match. Achieved through naked eye observation, systematic record keeping, and mathematical refinement carried out over centuries without a single instrument beyond the human eye, a clear horizon, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of skywatchers. The Venus tables in the Dresden Codex contain correction factors, built-in adjustments that the Maya scribes incorporated to account for the slight accumulated drift between their calculated cycles and the actual observed sky. This is a fundamentally scientific approach to data. You observe. You calculate. You compare your predictions against reality. You correct the model when reality diverges from the prediction. And you build the corrections into the system so the next generation of observers starts from a more accurate baseline. That is scientific method, practiced in a rainforest in Mesoamerica centuries before the European Enlightenment coined a phrase. The architecture made the astronomy visible to everyone. The Pyramid of El Castillo at Chichen Itza, built around 1000 CE, is a structure of precisely calculated astronomical alignment. The pyramid has 4 staircases, each with 91 steps. 4 times 91, plus the single platform at the top, equals 365. The number of days in a solar year, built into the staircase count of a temple. Twice a year, on the spring and fall equinoxes, the setting sun strikes the northwest corner of the pyramid and casts a series of triangular shadows along the north staircase that, together with the carved serpent head at the base, creates the illusion of a great serpent descending from the sky to the earth. The effect lasts for approximately 34 minutes as the sun moves. It draws thousands of visitors every year. It was engineered to work this way. Someone calculated the geometry. Someone understood the sun's angle on those specific dates well enough to build the illusion into the structure of a 79-foot stone pyramid. And it has been working twice a year for over 1,000 years. The intellectual achievements of the Maya did not exist in isolation from the material reality of sustaining millions of people in a challenging tropical environment. The same disciplined, observational intelligence that mapped the sky also managed the land. Modern satellite and aerial imaging technology, particularly LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to map terrain beneath jungle canopy, has revealed in the past decade an agricultural infrastructure across the Maya lowlands that is dramatically more extensive than archaeologists previously understood. Beneath the jungle of Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico lies a landscape that was almost entirely engineered. Vast networks of raised agricultural fields, canals to manage water distribution and drainage, terraced hillsides, and causeways connecting settlements across a terrain that would otherwise have been nearly impassable during the rainy season. A 2018 LiDAR survey in northern Guatemala revealed the remains of over 60,000 previously unknown structures, including farms, houses, and defensive fortifications, suggesting that the Maya lowlands supported a population density during the Classic period that was comparable to pre-industrial Europe. This was not a civilization scratching a modest living from a reluctant forest. This was a civilization that had systematically and intelligently transformed its environment to support a complex, densely populated urban society across a vast geographic area. And then, around 900 CE, the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands began to empty. The classic Maya collapse is one of the most debated events in the archaeology of the Americas. The evidence points not to a single cause, but to a convergence of pressures, prolonged drought, documented through lake sediment cores that show dramatically reduced rainfall across the Maya lowlands during the 9th century, political fragmentation and intensifying warfare between city-states, ecological stress from intensive agriculture, and possibly epidemic disease. The result was a cascade as weakened cities became unable to maintain the infrastructure and political order that sustained them, which weakened them further, which accelerated the abandonment. But here is the critical correction that the popular narrative almost always gets wrong. Maya civilization did not end in 900 CE. It adapted. Cities in the northern lowlands, including Chichen Itza and later Mayapan, continued to flourish for centuries after the southern collapse. Maya culture, Maya language, Maya astronomical knowledge, and Maya religious practice survived the conquest of the 16th century and survive to this day. There are approximately 6 million Maya people alive in the world right now. The civilization that mapped Venus and invented zero is not a past event. It is a living tradition. What the Spanish bishop Diego de Landa did in July of 1562, when he ordered the burning of Maya books at the town of Mani in the Yucatan, was an act of destruction whose full cost we will never be able to calculate. Thousands of books, the accumulated astronomical records, the mathematical tables, the historical chronicles, the medical knowledge of a civilization that had been systematically recording its understanding of the world for centuries. Gone in an afternoon. De Landa himself later expressed some regret and wrote one of the primary early accounts of Maya culture, a document that has ironically proved invaluable to modern decipherment efforts. The irony does not soften the loss. We recovered the Dresden Codex. We recovered 3 other books. We have the stones and the buildings and the LiDAR maps. And from those fragments, we have already reconstructed enough to know that what was destroyed was irreplaceable. The scale of what we do not know about the Maya is itself a measure of what was lost. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers were sheltering from storm near the small island of Antikythera, which sits in the channel between the Greek mainland and Crete. When the weather cleared, a diver named Elias Stadiatis descended to explore the seafloor near the island. What he found at a depth of approximately 150 feet was the wreck of a Roman-era cargo ship, lying where it had sunk sometime around 65 BCE, still loaded with its cargo of bronze and marble statues, glassware, jewelry, and pottery. The Greek government organized a salvage operation that ran through 1901. Divers recovered dozens of extraordinary objects from the wreck: magnificent bronze statues, marble sculptures, luxury goods that testified to the wealth and taste of whoever had commissioned the shipment. The objects were brought to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, cataloged and studied. Among the recovered items was a lump, a corroded, encrusted, unremarkable-looking mass of bronze and wood, roughly the size of a large shoebox, that had been fractured into several pieces by the process of recovery. It attracted some initial curiosity because it appeared to contain metal components of some kind within the corrosion. But it was not glamorous. It was not a beautiful statue or a glittering piece of jewelry. It sat in the museum, largely unstudied, for the better part of 2 decades. In 1902, an archaeologist named Valerio Staes looked more carefully at one of the fragments and noticed what appeared to be a gear wheel embedded in the corroded mass. He suggested the object might be some kind of astronomical instrument. The suggestion was not widely welcomed. The prevailing opinion among scholars at the time was that the ancient world was simply not capable of producing mechanical devices of that complexity, and that the gear must therefore either be a medieval intrusion into the wreck or a misidentification. The object went back into storage. It would be another half-century before the world began to understand what had actually been sitting in that museum all along. In the 1950s and 1960s, British physicist Derek de Solla Price began a serious scientific investigation of the Antikythera fragments using X-ray imaging. What the X-rays showed inside the corroded exterior stopped him cold. There were gears. Not one gear. Not a handful of gears. A system of interlocking bronze gears, at least 30 of them, of varying sizes, arranged in a configuration of extraordinary mechanical complexity. The teeth of the gears were cut with a precision that, when Price measured them, proved to be remarkably consistent and deliberate. This was not decorative metalwork. This was a functional mechanical system. And as Price worked to reconstruct its logic, the purpose of the device began to emerge. It was a computer. Not a computer in the electronic sense, of course, but in the precise, original meaning of the word, a device that computes. A machine that takes an input, processes it through a series of mechanical operations according to built-in rules, and produces an output. Turn a handle on the side of the device, and the interlocking gear trains would move in precise, calculated ratios, driving pointers across dials that displayed information about the state of the sky. The front of the device showed the position of the sun and moon in the zodiac, and the phase of the moon. The back of the device had 2 large spiral dials. The upper spiral tracked the metonic cycle, a 19-year period after which the phases of the moon repeat on the same calendar dates, a cycle fundamental to eclipse prediction. The lower spiral tracked the Saros cycle, an 18-year eclipse prediction cycle, and was marked with glyphs indicating the months in which solar and lunar eclipses were predicted to occur. A subsidiary dial on the back tracked the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games, including the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, and the Nemean Games, indicating the practical, civic utility of the device alongside its astronomical functions. Later analysis using CT scanning technology, conducted by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project in the early 2000s and by a team from University College London in 2021, revealed even more complexity hidden within the corrosion. The full mechanism appears to have also modeled the motions of the 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. It included a mechanism to represent the irregular motion of the moon across the sky, using a small pin-and-slot device that caused one gear to drive another at a variable rate, simulating the fact that the moon moves faster when it is closer to Earth and slower when it is farther away. This is a mechanical analog of what we now describe as Kepler's second law of planetary motion. The Antikythera mechanism was built sometime between approximately 260 BCE. It is over 2,100 years old, and for sheer mechanical sophistication, it was unmatched by anything produced in the known world for the next 1,400 years. One of the most important things to understand about the Antikythera mechanism is that it was almost certainly not unique. The Roman statesman and writer Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes seeing two devices that sound remarkably similar to the Antikythera mechanism. He writes about a sphere constructed by the Greek mathematician Archimedes, which when turned with a single rotation showed the successive movements of the moon, sun, and 5 planets across the sky, just as they occurred in the heavens day by day. He describes another similar device reportedly made by the Greek astronomer Posidonius. These are not mythological artifacts. These are references in credible Roman literature to a tradition of mechanical astronomical modeling in the Hellenistic Greek world, which means the Antikythera mechanism was not a single stroke of isolated genius. It was a product, a sophisticated, refined product of an intellectual and technical tradition that had been developing for some time. There were craftsmen who knew how to build these things. There were scholars who understood the mathematical and astronomical principles required to design them. There were patrons wealthy enough to commission them. This was an industry, however small, and that tradition was almost entirely lost. The texts describing these devices survive. The devices themselves, with the singular exception of the Antikythera mechanism, did not. At some point in the fragmentation of the Hellenistic world, the knowledge of how to build them ceased to be transmitted. The craftsmen died without apprentices, or the apprentices died without workshops, or the workshops were destroyed without successors. And the world lost the ability to build what the Hellenistic Greeks had been building for reasons that are, in the end, achingly mundane. Not conquest by superior intellect. Not the triumph of a better idea. Just the interruption of the chain of people passing knowledge forward. The Antikythera mechanism did not emerge from a vacuum. It was a product of one of the most extraordinary concentrations of scientific and intellectual talent in the ancient world. The Hellenistic civilization that flourished from roughly the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE through the absorption of the Greek world into the Roman Empire. Consider what this world produced in the space of a few centuries. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, working at the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, calculated the circumference of the Earth using the difference in the angle of the sun's shadow between two Egyptian cities on the summer solstice. His answer was approximately 24,662 miles. The actual circumference of the Earth is approximately 24,901 miles. His error was less than 2%. He calculated this without satellites, without GPS, without any instrument more sophisticated than a stick, a measuring wheel, and geometry. And he was essentially correct. Hipparchus of Nicaea, in the 2nd century BCE, compiled a star catalog of approximately 850 stars, assigned them coordinates, and in doing so created the first systematic map of the sky. He also calculated the length of the solar year to within 6.5 minutes of the modern measurement. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis over a roughly 26,000-year cycle, by comparing his own observations to earlier Greek records. This is a discovery that requires both access to historical astronomical data and the mathematical sophistication to detect a pattern within it. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, designed and described a steam-powered device called an eolipile, a hollow sphere mounted on a pivot that spun when steam was directed through two angled nozzles. It was the first known steam engine. He also described a programmable wheeled vehicle that used a system of ropes wound around axles to execute a preset sequence of movements. He designed coin-operated vending machines. He developed a system of pneumatics and hydraulics for theatrical stage effects. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most inventive engineers in the ancient world. These were not isolated figures. They corresponded with each other. They built on each other's work. They argued with each other's conclusions. They were operating within a scientific community sustained by institutions like the Library of Alexandria and the Mouseion, the ancient research institution attached to it, that provided the infrastructure for sustained intellectual work across generations. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single dramatic fire, as the popular myth would have it. The reality is more complex and, in its way, more heartbreaking. It declined gradually over several centuries through a combination of reduced funding, political instability, the dispersal of its scholars, and a series of partial destructions at different points in the late ancient period. By the time the Roman Empire in the West was collapsing in the 5th century CE, the great intellectual infrastructure of the Hellenistic world had already been largely dismantled. The knowledge it had housed, the astronomical tables, the mechanical treatises, the mathematical proofs, much of it had already ceased to be copied and studied and taught. And what is not copied and taught is, for all practical purposes, lost. The Antikythera mechanism sat on the seafloor for nearly 2,000 years because the civilization that produced it collapsed before anyone else had learned to build one. There is a question that historians of science return to with some regularity, and it is worth sitting with even if it cannot be answered. If the Hellenistic scientific tradition had continued uninterrupted, where would human knowledge be today? If the mechanical sophistication of the Antikythera mechanism had been preserved and developed rather than lost, if the tradition of Eratosthenes and Hipparchus and Hero of Alexandria had transmitted forward continuously rather than fracturing, what would the 10th century CE have looked like? The 15th? The 20th? It is not a frivolous question. It is not science fiction. It is a serious inquiry into the contingency of human progress. The degree to which the advancement of knowledge depends not on the inevitable unfolding of human potential, but on the fragile, interruptible, deeply human process of one person teaching another. The Antikythera mechanism is currently housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. If you go to Athens and stand in front of it, what you see is a corroded, fragmented object roughly the size of a large clock, sitting in a glass case. It does not look like much. But what it represents is the high-water mark of a scientific tradition that the world would not reach again for 14 centuries. It was found by sponge divers looking for a place to wait out a storm. A civilization that mapped the heavens from the jungles of Mesoamerica, that independently invented zero and encoded the movements of Venus into the stones of its temples. A civilization that built a working mechanical model of the solar system from bronze gears in the ancient Aegean and produced scientists who calculated the size of the Earth with 2% accuracy 2,000 years ago. Both forgotten for centuries. Both recovered not because history preserved them, but because a handful of determined people refused to accept the comfortable story that ancient human beings were incapable of this kind of brilliance. The Maya and the Hellenistic Greeks were separated by an ocean and by centuries. They shared no language, no trade, no communication of any kind. And yet, both of them looked up at the same sky and felt the same pull. The drive to understand it, to measure it, to build systems that could predict its behavior and make that knowledge permanent. To pass it forward. That drive is not Greek. It is not Maya. It is not the property of any single civilization or any particular century. It is human, and every time we recover a piece of it from the wreckage of a forgotten world, we are not learning something about them. We are remembering something about ourselves. Everything we have encountered so far in this documentary has shared a particular quality. Göbekli Tepe was unknown to us until 1994. The full scale of the Indus Valley civilization was buried and forgotten for over 3,000 years. The Minoans of Crete were erased so completely that the Greek civilization, which came after them, did not even record their proper name. The intellectual achievements of the Maya were systematically destroyed by the people who conquered them. And the Antikythera mechanism sat on a seafloor for 2,000 years before anyone understood what it was. These were civilizations the modern world had to rediscover. Cultures so thoroughly lost that recovering even a fraction of what they knew required decades of excavation, analysis, and scholarly argument. The civilization we are about to examine is different. It is not forgotten. It is not obscure. It is, in fact, one of the most studied, most referenced, and most mythologized civilizations in the entire history of the Western world. Its language is still used in law, in medicine, and in the Catholic Church. Its legal principles underpin the constitutional frameworks of dozens of modern nations. Its art, its architecture, and its literature have been continuously studied, imitated, and celebrated for 2,000 years. And yet, for all of that familiarity, for all of the centuries of study and admiration and imitation, we have still been dramatically underestimating it. Because the popular image of Rome, the gladiators and the togas and the Senate and the legions, that image, vivid and compelling as it is, has consistently distracted attention from something more quietly extraordinary. The thing that Rome built beneath the spectacle. The infrastructure, the concrete and the water and the roads, and the medicine and the engineering. The systems that kept 1 million people alive and functioning in a single city at a time when no other city on earth came close to that number. The true measure of Roman achievement is not what it looked like. It is what it did. And what it did in engineering terms was so far ahead of what the world would be capable of for more than 1,000 years after its collapse, that the gap between peak Rome and post-Roman Europe represents one of the most consequential technological regressions in the history of human civilization. This is not a story of greatness alone. It is a story of greatness lost, and of a long, painful, incomplete process of getting it back. In 2017, a team of researchers from the University of California, Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a study in the journal American Mineralogist that contained a finding so counterintuitive it required careful reading to fully absorb. Roman concrete, the material used to build harbor structures across the Mediterranean coast more than 2,000 years ago, was not degrading. It was getting stronger. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what concrete does over time. Modern concrete, the Portland cement-based material that is the foundational building substance of the contemporary world, begins degrading almost from the moment it is poured. Seawater is particularly destructive. The salt ions penetrate the concrete matrix, react with the calcium silicate hydrate that gives modern concrete its strength, and gradually break it apart from the inside. The expected service life of modern marine concrete is approximately 50 years. After that, it begins to deteriorate. Most marine concrete structures require ongoing maintenance, repair, and eventual replacement. Roman maritime concrete, the researchers found, was doing the opposite. The Romans built their harbor walls and sea barriers using a specific mixture that differed fundamentally from modern concrete in one critical respect. Instead of Portland cement, Roman concrete used a volcanic ash called pozzolana, mixed with seawater and lime to create a binding paste, and then combined with chunks of volcanic rock called tuff. When seawater penetrated the cured concrete, it did not attack the material. It reacted with the volcanic ash to grow new mineral crystals, specifically a mineral called tobermarite and another called philipsite, within the microscopic gaps in the concrete matrix. These crystals actively reinforced the material from within. The concrete was not just resisting the sea. It was incorporating it, using it, growing stronger through contact with the very environment that destroys its modern equivalent. Harbor structures at Caesarea Maritima in modern Israel, at Pozzuoli in Italy, and at numerous other Roman coastal sites have been standing in the ocean for over 2,000 years. They are structurally sound. The seawater has been strengthening them for 20 centuries. And the recipe that makes this possible, the specific combination of volcanic ash, seawater, lime, and tuff, was lost when the Roman Empire collapsed. We knew it had existed. We could see the evidence of it standing in harbors all around the Mediterranean. But we could not reproduce it because the Romans who knew how to make it did not write the formula down in a form that survived. It took modern chemists, working with electron microscopes and synchrotron X-ray analysis to reverse engineer what Roman builders knew from practice and tradition. The concrete formula has now been largely reconstructed. Researchers and engineers are currently investigating how to incorporate it into modern marine construction. We are, in the 21st century, learning a building technique from the first. That is not a footnote in the story of Roman engineering. That is the story of Roman engineering. The knowledge was so good that losing it set the field back 2,000 years. There's a phrase so familiar that it has become almost meaningless. All roads lead to Rome. We use it as a metaphor for inevitability, for convergence, for the idea that every path eventually arrives at the same destination. But the phrase was originally a geographical statement. And as geographical statements go, it was very nearly literally accurate. At the height of the Roman Empire, the road network covered approximately 250,000 miles across 3 continents. Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia were connected by a system of roads that ranged from local dirt tracks to the great paved highways called Vie, the arterial routes that tied the empire together militarily, commercially, and administratively. The Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Aurelia, the Via Egnatia running east through Greece and into what is now Turkey. These were not simply paths between places. They were engineered infrastructure of a standard that would not be systematically replicated in Europe for 1,500 years. The construction of a major Roman road was a layered engineering project. Workers first excavated a trench, sometimes several feet deep, depending on the terrain and the expected traffic. The trench was filled in successive layers. First a layer of large stones or gravel for drainage, then a layer of smaller broken stone, sometimes set in lime mortar, then a layer of concrete or compacted material, and on top, a surface of carefully fitted stone slabs, set with a slight crown, meaning the center of the road was higher than the edges, so that rainwater drained off to the sides rather than pooling on the surface. Drainage ditches ran alongside the road to carry that water away. Milestones were placed at regular intervals. Rest stations and inns were positioned at predictable points along the major routes. The result was a road surface durable enough, in many cases, to still be structurally present beneath modern roads today. Surveys in Britain, France, Italy, and Turkey have repeatedly confirmed that sections of Roman road lie directly beneath contemporary asphalt, still contributing to the structural integrity of the modern surface above them. The road beneath the road. The Roman engineering holding up the world that replaced it without knowing it was there. But the roads were not merely physical infrastructure. They were the nervous system of the empire. Roman military units could move at a sustained pace across the road network that allowed legions to travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks. Government dispatches traveled the same routes. Merchants moved goods from the grain fields of North Africa to the markets of London, from the silk routes of the east to the ports of the western Mediterranean. The road network did not just connect Roman cities. It created the economic and administrative unity that made the Roman Empire function as a single entity across its enormous geographic extent. When the Western Empire collapsed across the 5th century CE, the roads began to deteriorate. Without the central authority, the tax base, and the organized labor to maintain them, the surfaces broke apart. Bridges were not repaired. Drainage systems silted up. Within a few generations, travel across Europe that had taken days on the Roman network began to take weeks on the deteriorating remnants. The fragmentation of the road system was not merely an inconvenience. It was a direct contributor to the political and economic fragmentation that defined medieval Europe for centuries. When you cannot move people, goods, and information efficiently, you cannot maintain a large, integrated political structure. The roads held the empire together. When the roads failed, so did everything built on top of them. A city of 1 million people needs water. Not just water for drinking. Water for cooking, for bathing, for washing streets, for supplying public fountains and baths and workshops and tanneries and bakeries. Water in quantities that, in an era before electric pumps and pressurized municipal supply systems, presented an engineering challenge of the first order. Rome solved it with aqueducts, and the solution was so thorough, so well-engineered, and so generously scaled that it produced a water abundance that many modern cities, with all their technological advantages, would be hard-pressed to match on a per capita basis. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was served by 11 major aqueducts, the oldest of which, the Aqua Appia, dated to 312 BCE, and the largest of which, the Anio Novus, ran for over 58 miles before delivering its water to the city. Together, Rome's aqueducts delivered an estimated 300 million gallons of water to the city every day, divided across an estimated population of 1 million people. That is approximately 300 gallons per person per day. For comparison, average per capita daily water consumption in the United States today, including residential, commercial, and industrial use, is estimated at around 80 to 100 gallons. Rome, in the 3rd century CE, was delivering 3 times that amount per person. The engineering that made this possible was a masterclass in applied mathematics and patient, precise construction. Roman aqueducts worked entirely by gravity. There were no pumps. Water entered the system at a source, typically a spring or a dammed river in the hills surrounding Rome, and flowed downhill through an enclosed channel, across bridges and through tunnels, losing elevation at a carefully calculated rate across the entire length of the structure. The Aqua Claudia, completed in 52 CE under the Emperor Claudius, ran for approximately 43 miles from its source in the Anio Valley to the city. Across those 43 miles, it dropped in elevation by a total of approximately 1,400 feet at a gradient of roughly 1 foot of drop for every 160 feet of horizontal distance. Maintaining that gradient within the necessary tolerances through changes in terrain that included valleys requiring elevated arched bridges and hills requiring tunnels, was a surveying and construction challenge that required both precise measurement and extraordinary attention to detail across an enormous linear distance. The water that arrived at the city was distributed first to a large settling tank that allowed sediment to drop out, then through a system of lead and stone pipes to a hierarchy of distribution points. First the imperial buildings and public infrastructure, then the public fountains and baths, and finally, through private connections that required payment, to wealthy homes and commercial establishments. The public fountains were designed to overflow continuously, so the overflow kept the street-level channels flushed and flowing. Rome's streets were self-cleaning because the water supply was deliberately overgenerous. The overflow was part of the design. The baths of Caracalla, completed around 217 CE, could accommodate approximately 1,600 bathers simultaneously. They covered over 50 acres of ground and included not just bathing pools of varying temperatures, but gymnasiums, libraries, gardens, and spaces for social gathering. They were heated by a hypocaust system, the Roman underfloor heating technology, and supplied by a dedicated branch of the Aqua Marcia aqueduct. Entry was either free or available at a nominal cost that placed it within reach of ordinary Romans. Public bathing in ancient Rome was not a luxury for the wealthy. It was a civic institution available to essentially everyone, maintained by public funds, and considered a basic element of what the Roman state owed its citizens. The idea that clean, temperature-controlled bathing facilities should be accessible to ordinary working people, regardless of their personal wealth, was a social philosophy built into stone and heated water and expressed at enormous public expense. Central heating would not return to European domestic and public architecture at comparable scale until the invention of steam and hot water radiator systems in the 19th century CE. The public baths of Rome were not surpassed as civic infrastructure in the Western world for over 1,600 years. In the center of modern Rome, a short walk from the Campo de' Fiori, there is a building that has been in continuous use for nearly 1,900 years. It was built as a temple to all the gods of Rome. It became a Christian church in 609 CE. It still functions as a church today. It holds the tombs of the painter Raphael and of two Italian kings. On any given afternoon, tourists queue outside its bronze doors in numbers that would have been familiar to the Romans who first built it. The building is the Pantheon, and it contains something that, when you understand its engineering context, is difficult to look at without feeling a kind of vertigo. The dome. The dome of the Pantheon spans 142 feet from one side to the other. When it was completed around 125 CE under the Emperor Hadrian, it was the largest dome in the world. It held that title for 1,292 years, until the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence was completed by Brunelleschi in 1436 CE. Nearly 13 centuries. No one in the world, across the entire span of the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic architectural tradition, the Romanesque and early Gothic periods of European architecture, could build a larger dome than the one Hadrian's engineers had already built. The engineering of the Pantheon's dome is a study in deliberate, sophisticated weight management. The dome is not uniform in its construction. Near the base, where the stresses are greatest, the concrete is dense and heavy, incorporating large pieces of travertine limestone and tuff. As the dome rises, the aggregate changes. Lighter stones, then brick, then pumice near the top. The walls supporting the dome are not solid. They contain a series of internal chambers and relieving arches that distribute the dome's weight downward and outward in carefully managed paths, reducing the compressive stress at any single point in the structure. The famous oculus, the circular opening at the crown of the dome, 27 feet in diameter and open to the sky, is not simply a design choice. It removes the heaviest, most structurally problematic material from the point of maximum stress at the top of the dome, and the hole itself acts as a compression ring that stabilizes the dome's geometry. This building was designed by engineers who understood, through experience and calculation, how forces move through structures, who understood that a building does not simply hold weight from above, but channels and redirects it, and that the art of engineering is the art of giving those forces a path they can follow without destroying the structure around them. The Pantheon has no internal supports, no columns beneath the dome. You stand inside it and look up through 142 feet of open air to a circle of sky, and the dome above you has been doing this, unsupported, since roughly 125 CE. The concrete that holds it up is the same Roman volcanic ash concrete that is strengthening rather than degrading. And the building simply stands there in the middle of one of the world's most visited cities, being used as a church on Sundays and a tourist attraction every other day of the week, as if nearly 2 centuries of existence is not a particularly remarkable achievement. It is. It is one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of human construction. And the civilization that built it lost the ability to build anything like it within a few centuries of its completion. The image of ancient medicine in the popular imagination tends toward the unpleasant. Crude instruments, dangerous ignorance, treatments that frequently made patients worse rather than better. And for much of the ancient world and the medieval period, that image is not entirely unfair. But Roman military medicine, at its peak, was something considerably more sophisticated than the image suggests. And the evidence for this comes from 2 places: the texts that survive and the instruments found in the ruins. At Pompeii, the city buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, archaeologists recovered a collection of surgical instruments from the house of a surgeon that is now displayed in the National Archaeological Museum of Naples. The collection includes scalpels with detachable blades of varying sizes, bone forceps for extracting fragments from wounds, hooks and probes for exploring injuries, a surgical saw for amputations, catheters for urinary obstruction, specula for examining body cavities, and needle holders and sutures for closing wounds. These instruments are not primitive. When 19th century surgeons first examined them in detail, several noted that the Roman instruments were recognizably similar in design to instruments still in use at the time. The functional logic of a scalpel, a probe, a retractor, a bone saw, these are solutions to physical problems that do not have many alternative solutions, and the Romans had arrived at them through centuries of empirical practice. The Roman military surgeon, called a medicus, was a trained professional who traveled with the legions and operated on battlefield casualties under conditions that would test any surgeon in any era. Roman military camps, called castra, included dedicated hospital buildings, valetinaria, with multiple wards, storage for medical supplies, and operating rooms. The existence of purpose-built military hospitals, designed and funded as permanent infrastructure by the Roman state, reflects an institutional commitment to keeping soldiers alive that was itself an expression of sophisticated organizational thinking. Roman surgeons performed cataract couching, a procedure that displaced a clouded lens in the eye to restore partial vision. They performed trepanation, cutting openings in the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries, with a survival rate that skeletal evidence suggests was not negligible. They performed amputations with subsequent survival, as evidenced by skeletons showing well-healed amputation wounds. They ligated arteries during surgery to control bleeding, and they used antiseptics, not because they understood germ theory, which would not be developed for 1,800 years, but because empirical observation had taught them that wounds treated with wine or vinegar healed better than wounds that were not. The alcohol and acetic acid in those substances killed bacteria that Roman surgeons could not see and did not know existed. Germ theory validated in 1865 CE what Roman military practice had been doing in 100 CE. The mechanism was unknown. The outcome was correct. When the Roman medical tradition fragmented along with the empire, the institutional knowledge that had been embedded in the military hospital system, in the training of medici, in the organized supply chains for medical equipment and pharmacological materials, that knowledge became inaccessible to most of Europe. Medieval medicine was not uniformly barbaric, but it operated without the institutional scaffolding that Roman medicine had possessed, and without that scaffolding, knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries had to be painfully, partially, and incompletely reconstructed. Feeding a city of 1 million people in the ancient world was not a problem with an obvious solution. It required a supply chain of extraordinary complexity, sustained over centuries, drawing agricultural production from enormous distances and moving it reliably into the city across all seasons and all weather conditions. Rome solved this problem so thoroughly that at its height, ordinary Roman citizens, including the urban poor, had access to a diet that in certain respects compared favorably to the diets available to the urban poor of 18th and 19th century European cities more than 1,500 years later. The grain supply, called the annona, was a state-managed operation that drew wheat primarily from the breadbaskets of North Africa and Egypt, the most productive agricultural regions in the Mediterranean world. Roman merchant ships, some of them among the largest wooden vessels the ancient world produced, capable of carrying over 1,000 tons of grain, made the regular crossing from Alexandria and Carthage to the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. From Ostia, the grain was transferred to smaller river barges and pulled upstream to Rome, where it was unloaded, stored in enormous state granaries, and distributed. The distribution itself was managed through a system called the fermentatio, a state program that provided a monthly grain ration to a registered list of Roman citizens, the number fluctuating over time, but reaching approximately 320,000 recipients at certain points in the imperial period. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was a political and social institution, a recognition by the Roman state that maintaining social stability in a densely populated city required ensuring that the basic nutritional needs of the urban population were met as a matter of public policy. Beyond grain, Rome was supplied with olive oil from Spain and North Africa, wine from across the Mediterranean, fish sauce called garum from processing facilities in Iberia and along the coast of North Africa, salted fish, dried fruits, and a range of spices and luxury foods from as far as India and sub-Saharan Africa. The city contained hundreds of commercial bakeries, thermopolia, which were essentially ancient fast food establishments serving hot food from street-front counters, and a range of market facilities organized by product type. The ruins of Pompeii have given archaeologists an extraordinarily complete picture of what this street-level food economy looked like, and what it reveals is a sophisticated, diverse, commercially organized food system that served all economic levels of the urban population. Maintaining this supply chain required the merchant fleet, the port infrastructure at Ostia, the river logistics, the state grain administration, the storage facilities, the distribution system, and the commercial food economy of the city itself, all functioning simultaneously and continuously. It was one of the largest and most complex logistical operations in the ancient world, and it kept 1 million people fed in a city that would not see that population level again for well over 1,000 years after the supply chain collapsed. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is one of the most analyzed events in the history of historical scholarship. Hundreds of books and thousands of academic papers have been written attempting to identify the primary cause or causes of a process that unfolded across more than a century, from the crisis of the 3rd century CE through the final deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE. The debate is genuinely complex and has not been resolved. Military pressure from migrating peoples along the northern and eastern frontiers, internal political instability, and the destabilizing frequency of civil war and imperial assassination, economic strain from the cost of maintaining the military, the fragmentation of civic identity as the empire expanded beyond its administrative coherence, the role of pandemic disease, including the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian, in reducing the population and disrupting the labor force. All of these are legitimate contributing factors that serious historians weigh against each other. But here is what the debate about causes sometimes obscures. The question of what the fall actually meant in practical material terms for the people who lived through it and after it. The population of the city of Rome at its height was somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million people. By the 6th century CE, it had fallen to somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000. That is a population collapse of over 95% in the space of roughly 200 years. The water stopped flowing the aqueducts because no one was maintaining them, and the infrastructure was being stripped for building material. The great public baths closed. The roads deteriorated. The port at Ostia silted up and shrank. The grain supply from North Africa was disrupted and then permanently severed as the Vandal kingdom took control of the region. The city did not simply lose its status as a political capital. It lost the ability to function at the scale it had been built for. The aqueducts that had delivered 300 million gallons a day to a city of 1 million now delivered water to a city that could not maintain the pipes. The roads that had connected an empire now ran through a landscape of petty kingdoms that lacked the authority and the resources to repair them. The Pantheon stood, the Colosseum stood, the ruins of the baths stood, and a few thousand people lived among them, in a city that was simultaneously a monument to what had been and a vivid daily demonstration of how far things had fallen. The historian Brian Ward Perkins, in his analysis of the material evidence for post-Roman Britain, documents a collapse so complete that it is visible in the archaeological record across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Fine pottery, the kind of standardized, wheel-thrown, kiln-fired tableware that had been available to ordinary Roman Britons at low cost, essentially disappeared from the archaeological record for centuries. Literacy rates collapsed. Long-distance trade collapsed. The construction of large stone buildings essentially ceased for generations. Roof tiles, a basic element of Roman construction, so common that their fragments litter every Roman-era archaeological site in Britain, stopped being produced. And the evidence for a significant reduction in the average body size of the population, an indicator of reduced nutrition, appears in the skeletal record for the post-Roman period. This was not simply a change of government. This was a regression across essentially every measurable dimension of material civilization. And it lasted, in varying degrees depending on the region, for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. The Roman Empire did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was vast, and vast things are fragile in ways that small things are not. The complexity that made Rome extraordinary, the interdependence of its supply chains, the scale of its infrastructure, the geographic spread of its administration, was also the source of its vulnerability. When the system began to fail, it failed at a scale and speed that nothing in the preceding experience of European civilization had prepared anyone to manage. What it left behind was the skeleton of a world. The roads slowly crumbling, the aqueducts running dry, the concrete of the harbor walls strengthening in the sea, the dome of the Pantheon still standing, the law written down in text that survived the political collapse even when the institutions that enforced the law did not, and the memory, however distorted, of what a city could be when it was properly engineered and properly supplied and properly administered. That memory drove every subsequent attempt to rebuild. Every medieval king who looked at Roman ruin and understood, even without the technical knowledge to replicate it, that the people who built this had known something worth knowing. Every Renaissance architect who studied the Pantheon and tried to understand the dome. Every 19th century engineer who rebuilt the sewer systems of London and Paris by, consciously or not, returning to principles that Roman engineers had already worked out 1,800 years earlier. Rome did not simply fall. It deposited its knowledge into the ground and into the surviving texts and into the stones of its buildings. And the civilization that came after it spent centuries carefully, incompletely, and sometimes brilliantly excavating what had been left behind. 6 civilizations. We have now met all of them. A temple built before farming. Cities with sewers before Europe had cities at all. An island palace with running water and earthquake-resistant walls. A jungle civilization that mapped Venus and invented zero. A bronze computer that modeled the solar system 2,100 years ago. And an empire that delivered more water per person per day to its capital city than most modern American cities deliver today. And then lost the formula for the concrete that held it all together. Each of them extraordinary. Each of them, in ways that the history we were handed did not prepare us for. Far more advanced than we thought. And each of them gone. Not because they were overtaken by something better in every respect. Not because history moved in the clean, progressive line we were taught to expect. But because the systems that sustained them were complex, and complexity is fragile. Because knowledge lives in people and institutions, and people die and institutions collapse. Because the thread that carries what a civilization knows forward through time can be cut. And when it is cut, the knowledge does not wait patiently to be recovered. It disappears, and the world has to learn it again, slowly, painfully, often without knowing it is relearning something that was already known. That is the story of Rome, and it is in different forms the story of every civilization we have examined today. And that story is not finished. It has one more chapter. The one that asks what we do with all of this. What it means. What it demands of us. What these 6 civilizations, taken together, are trying to tell us across 12,000 years of human achievement and loss. That chapter is next. There's a moment in every long journey when you stop moving forward and turn around. Not to go back, but to see where you have been. To look at the full distance traveled and understand, for the first time, the shape of the path beneath your feet. The pattern that was invisible while you were inside it. We have traveled a long way in this documentary. We have stood at the edge of a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey and watched the oldest temple in the world emerge from the hillside. We have walked the grid-planned streets of a Bronze Age city in South Asia whose drainage system would not be equaled for 4,000 years. We have traced the clay pipes of a Minoan palace that delivered pressurized water to upper floors while Europe was still centuries away from anything resembling urban sanitation. We have followed the Venus tables of Maya astronomers who calculated the movements of a planet to an accuracy of 2 hours across 500 years of observation. We have held, in our minds, the bronze gears of a 2,100-year-old mechanical computer that modeled the solar system with a precision the world would not recover for 1,400 years. And we have stood in the shadow of a concrete dome that has been standing, unsupported, for nearly 19 centuries, built by an empire that delivered more water per person to its capital city than most of the modern world manages today. 6 civilizations, 12,000 years of human ambition. And now the turn. The moment to look back at the full shape of what we have seen and ask the question that all of it together is asking us. What is the pattern? Because there is one, running beneath all 6 stories, connecting them across the enormous distances of time and geography and culture that separate them. There is a single thread. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. None of these civilizations were inevitable. Not one of them arose automatically from the conditions around it. Not one of them was the guaranteed product of geography or climate or available resources alone. Every single one of them required a critical decision, made over and over again across generations by people who would never live to see the full result of their choices. The decision to build something that would take longer than a single lifetime to complete. The decision to observe the sky, not just tonight, but for centuries, recording what was seen so that the next generation could see further. The decision to teach what you knew to someone younger than yourself, and trust that they would carry it forward. The decision to invest in the infrastructure that makes ordinary life better for ordinary people, even when ordinary life offers no immediate reward for that investment. These were not passive civilizations. They were not the accidental products of favorable conditions. They were the active choices of people who decided, generation after generation, that knowledge was worth preserving, that the next generation deserved to inherit more than the current one had received, that the work of building something lasting was worth doing, even if the builder would not be there to see it last. And in every single case, that chain of decisions eventually broke. Not because the people failed, not because the ideas were wrong, but because chains break. Because the conditions that allow knowledge to accumulate and transmit are specific and fragile, and ultimately dependent on a level of institutional continuity that no human society has yet managed to sustain forever. That is the pattern, and it is the most important thing this documentary has to say. Let's be precise about what fragility means in this context, because it is easy to hear the word and imagine something delicate, something obviously vulnerable, something that a reasonable person would have taken better care of. The civilizations in this documentary were not delicate. They were, in many respects, among the most robust and capable human societies that have ever existed. Rome maintained a coherent political and administrative structure across 3 continents for centuries. The Maya sustained a complex urban civilization in a tropical rainforest environment for over 2,000 years. The Indus Valley maintained standardized weights and measurements across a geographic area larger than Western Europe for at least 700 years. These were not fragile cultures in the ordinary sense. They were extraordinarily resilient. And yet every one of them reached a point where the thread broke, where the chain of transmission snapped. What would have been known ceased to be known. Consider the specific gaps. The gap between the construction of the Antikythera mechanism, around 150 to 60 BCE, and the next device of comparable mechanical complexity, which appears in medieval European clockwork around 1300 CE, is approximately 1,400 years. 14 centuries during which the knowledge of how to build that device existed nowhere in the world in a form that anyone could access. The Hellenistic engineers who designed it did not record their methods in a text that survived. The craftsmen who built it did not found a school that persisted. The device went down with a ship, and the tradition that produced it went down with the civilization that housed it. And the world had to wait 14 centuries for the mechanical sophistication to return. The gap between peak Roman engineering, let us place it roughly in the 2nd century CE under Trajan and Hadrian, and the point at which European construction began to seriously approach comparable ambition and scale again, is approximately 1,000 years. 1,000 years during which the formula for self-strengthening marine concrete sat locked in the composition of harbor walls that no one could any longer read. During which the engineering logic of the hypocaust, the underfloor heating system that warmed Roman baths and wealthy homes from Britain to Syria, was forgotten so thoroughly that when European scholars began encountering Roman ruins and trying to understand them in the medieval period, some of them could not determine what the raised floors and hollow walls were for. The gap between the abandonment of the great Indus Valley cities around 1900 BCE and the next comparable urban sanitation infrastructure in South Asia is a gap measured in millennia. The gap between the collapse of Minoan hydraulic engineering around 1450 BCE and the return of pressurized piped water to European domestic and civic architecture is so large it extends into the modern era. These are not gaps in a story of continuous progress. These are absences, voids, places in the timeline where something that had been known was no longer known, and the world had to proceed without it. And the people living in those centuries of absence had no way of knowing what they were missing because the knowledge of what had been possible was itself part of what had been lost. This is the specific character of civilizational fragility. It is not that the building falls down. It is that the knowledge of how to build it disappears. And knowledge, unlike stone, leaves no ruin. When knowledge is gone, it is simply gone. There is no visible wreckage. There is only the absence. And absences are very easy to mistake for inevitability, for the natural state of things, for evidence that what was lost was never really there. Every generation that lived in the centuries after Rome, looking at aqueducts they could not repair and roads they could not resurface and baths they could not heat, had to make a choice about what those ruins meant. Many of them concluded that the people who built those things must have been superhuman, must have had help from gods or giants or some other force beyond ordinary human capacity, because ordinary human beings, by which they meant themselves, clearly could not do what the evidence said had been done. They were wrong. The builders of those aqueducts were ordinary human beings, trained, organized, funded, and operating within an institutional context that supported and sustained their work. The institutions were gone. The training was gone. The funding was gone. The organizational context was gone. But the capacity was never gone. It was waiting. It is always waiting. And yet, for all the losses, for all the gaps and absences and broken chains, something always came through. Not everything. Never everything. But something. Always something. The Maya Zero did not vanish from the world. It traveled through trade routes and cultural exchange and the work of scholars who did not know they were carrying a Maya inheritance into the Arabic mathematical tradition, and from there into medieval European algebra, and from there into every calculation performed by every computer on Earth today. When you balance a bank account, when a satellite adjusts its orbit, when a pharmaceutical researcher runs a statistical analysis, the mathematics they're using rests at its deepest foundation on a positional number system that requires zero. The Maya astronomers who developed that concept in the rainforests of Mesoamerica centuries before Europe knew it existed are, in a very precise sense, present in every mathematical operation performed in the modern world. Their contribution is invisible. It is also inescapable. The road alignments of the Roman Empire survive beneath the highways of modern Europe in ways that go beyond the literal presence of Roman stone beneath modern asphalt. The routes themselves persist. The decision made by Roman engineers 2,000 years ago about the most efficient path between two cities, between London and Dover, between Paris and Lyon, between Rome and Naples, those decisions shaped the geography of European settlement and commerce so thoroughly that the cities grew along those routes, and the routes became highways, and the highways became the arteries of modern European economic life. The Roman road network is not a historical curiosity. It is, in a meaningful sense, still functioning, still organizing the movement of people and goods across the continent. 1,500 years after the empire that built it ceased to exist. The Indus Valley's contribution is harder to trace because the civilization was so thoroughly buried and its script remains unread, but certain researchers have identified echoes of Indus urban planning philosophy in the historic cities of the Indian subcontinent, and the emphasis on water management, public bathing, and organized street layouts that recurs across South Asian urban traditions. The knowledge may have traveled not through texts, but through the more durable channel of cultural practice, of the ways people learned to live together in cities, passed forward not as written doctrine, but as inherited habit. The Minoan legacy travels through the alphabet, through linear A to linear B, from linear B to the Greek alphabet, from the Greek alphabet to Latin, from Latin to every language in the Western world that uses the characters you are reading in this very moment. The Minoan scribes who pressed their symbols into clay at Knossos around 1800 BCE could not have imagined the English language, could not have imagined the United States, or the internet, or documentary films, or any of the contexts in which their distant descendants would eventually be communicating. But the form they gave to written communication, the idea that language could be systematically encoded in a set of symbols pressed into a surface, that idea traveled forward through every transformation of the cultures that carried it, and it arrived here. In this sentence, in these words, the builders of Göbekli Tepe left something less tangible, but perhaps more fundamental still. They left the evidence that the impulse to build something larger than yourself, to organize collective effort around a shared purpose that offers no immediate personal survival benefit, to reach towards something that can only be called transcendent, that this impulse is not a product of civilization. It is older than civilization. It is, if the evidence of that buried temple in the hills of Turkey means what archaeologists believe it means, one of the things that made civilization possible. The drive to build the temple came before the farm. The ambition preceded the abundance. The hunger for meaning was there before the hunger for food had been reliably answered. That is the oldest human legacy. It has not been lost. Look around at any human society, in any era, on any continent. You will find it. The temple, the monument, the work that takes longer than a single life to complete. The thing built not for personal gain, but for the generations that come after, who will not know the names of the people who built it and will not need to. Because the thing itself is the message. The thing itself says, we were here. We reached. We made something that was worth making. We gave it to you. That message has been traveling for 12,000 years. It has survived the collapse of every civilization that sent it. And it has arrived. We began this documentary with a question. What if we have been dramatically underestimating the people who came before us? Having traveled 12,000 years across 6 civilizations, through the evidence of what they built and calculated and engineered and observed and lost, the answer is not simply yes. The answer is yes, and the implications of that underestimation are larger than they might first appear. Because when we underestimate the people who came before us, we are not just making an error about history. We are making an error about human nature. We are implicitly accepting a version of the human story in which genius and ambition and intellectual power are recent developments, in which the capacity for organized, sophisticated, technically precise civilization is something that modern humanity possesses in a way that our ancestors did not, in which we are categorically, fundamentally different from and superior to the people who came before us. The evidence of this documentary demolishes that assumption completely. The people who built Göbekli Tepe without farming, without permanent settlements, without any of the prerequisites our histories said they needed, were not less intelligent than we are. They were not less ambitious. They were not less capable of abstract thought, long-term planning, or collective action toward shared purpose. They were human beings, fully human, operating with the same cognitive hardware that every human being has operated with for at least 300,000 years. The engineers of the Indus Valley who designed those drainage systems. The Minoan hydraulic specialists who calculated parabolic pipe cross-sections to prevent sediment buildup. The Maya astronomers who built correction factors into their Venus tables because they understood that their model needed to be tested against reality and refined when it diverged. The Hellenistic craftsmen who cut 30 bronze gears to tolerances precise enough to model the motion of 5 planets. The Roman engineers who calculated the gradient of a 43-mile aqueduct to within fractions of a degree across its entire length. These are not proto-humans fumbling toward competence. These were skilled, trained, disciplined specialists operating at the edge of what their knowledge and their tools allowed. What separated them from us is not intelligence, not ambition, not the fundamental human capacity to observe, reason, experiment, and build. What separated them from us is accumulated knowledge. The specific technical and scientific inheritance that has been passed forward through the particular chain of transmission that connects the present to the past. They did not have everything we have, but they had in certain specific and remarkable domains, things that we lost and had to rebuild. And in rebuilding them, we sometimes produced something inferior to what we were replacing. The marine concrete is the most striking example, but it is not the only one. We are the inheritors of everything these civilizations managed to pass forward through the wreckage of their collapses. The mathematics, the roads, the alphabets, the architectural principles, the astronomical observations, the medical practices, the philosophical frameworks, all of it traveling forward through fire and flood and conquest and neglect and the simple, ordinary mortality of the individual human beings who carried it, arriving here in us, incomplete and partial and sometimes barely recognizable, but present. And we are also the inheritors of everything they lost. Every technique that was not written down. Every astronomical table that was burned. Every formula that died with the last person who knew it. Every chain of transmission that broke before it could reach us. We carry the losses too, as absences. As gaps in what we know that we cannot even fully identify, because we do not know what we are missing. That is the human condition, as these 6 civilizations reveal it. Not a story of inevitable progress. Not a story of continuous ascent from primitive darkness to modern light. But a story of extraordinary human ambition, repeatedly and ingeniously expressed, repeatedly and painfully interrupted, and repeatedly, stubbornly, improbably resumed. A story of people who built temples before they had farms, who laid sewer pipes before they had alphabets, who mapped the stars from jungle clearings without telescopes, who cut gears to model the solar system without computers, who poured concrete that the sea would strengthen rather than erode. People who, in every time and every place, looked at the world they had inherited and decided it was worth understanding, worth improving, worth building upon, worth passing forward. People, in other words, exactly like us. That is what these 6 civilizations are telling us, across 12,000 years of stone and bronze and clay and bone and water and light. Not that the past was golden. Not that everything has been downhill since some lost age of perfection. But that the capacity has always been there. In every era, in every culture, in every corner of the human world, the capacity to look at what is and imagine what could be, to organize around a shared purpose larger than individual survival, to build something that will outlast the builder, to pass knowledge forward across the terrifying uncertainty of time. That capacity is not something we developed. It is something we are. It is the oldest and most consistent thing we know about ourselves. And these 6 civilizations, recovered from the ground and the seabed and the jungle canopy by generations of curious, determined, reverently attentive scholars, are its evidence. The past is not behind us. It has never been behind us. It is underneath us, in the roads we drive, in the mathematics we use, in the letters we read, in the concrete of harbor walls still hardening at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, in the shadow of a descending serpent on the steps of a pyramid twice a year, as reliably as it has always been, as long as the sun still sets at the angle it has always set. We are the continuation of something very, very old, something that has survived everything, something that, if the evidence of these 6 civilizations means what I believe it means, is not going to stop now. If this journey through 12,000 years of human ingenuity has left you with anything, I hope it is this. The next time someone describes the ancient world as primitive, the next time the word backward is applied to a people who built without our tools and thought without our accumulated inheritance, I hope you remember what you now know. I hope you remember the drainage pipes of Mohenjo-Daro and the Venus tables of the Maya and the gears of the Antikythera mechanism and the concrete of a harbor wall that has been growing stronger in the sea since before the birth of every religion currently practiced on Earth. History, told honestly, is one of the most astonishing things there is, and there is so much more of it to tell. If you found this journey worth taking, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who has not taken it yet. Someone who still thinks the ancient world was simple. Someone who might be just as astonished as you were to discover what was really out there, buried in the hills and the seafloor and the jungle, waiting to be found. Like this video if it changed the way you think about something. Subscribe if you want to keep going, because there are more stories like this one. More civilizations. More discoveries. More moments where the evidence says something that our received history was not prepared for. The ancients left us a great deal. The least we can do is pay attention.